this story. This is a story that was reported by the BBC in 2020. It's the story of Rose Lember in America. She was kidnapped at the age of 14, taken to a warehouse and gang raped at knife point for 12 hours. This is obviously horrific, but the trauma didn't end there. She discovered a few weeks later that some parts of her ordeal had been filmed and uploaded onto Pornhub with titles like that. This had a devastating impact on her, and there's lots more we can say about how this is even allowed to happen. But some of the videos had hundreds of thousands of hits. So how have we got to this state of society where hundreds of thousands of ordinary men will consume child sexual abuse and rape as a form of entertainment? A lot of people don't particularly make the connection between mainstream online pornography and child sexual abuse, but there are multiple links, and I'd just like to share some of them with you today. First of all, I want to talk about how pornography minimises the harm of sexual abuse. Secondly, how it drives offending behaviour. And thirdly, how it exacerbates vulnerability. But a bit of background about the industry first. We don't hear much about the porn industry, but it's mushroomed into the most enormous, global, multi-billion-dollar industry that's extremely powerful. All of this is down to the internet. The internet made pornography affordable, accessible, and anonymous, and this was an absolute game changer. Made it extremely normalised and ubiquitous. And the fact that pornography sort of moved from the margins into the mainstream is also because of the concerted efforts of the PR industry, the PR arm of the porn industry. As Dr. Gail Vine said in her book Pornland, what we see today is a result of years of careful strategizing and marketing by the porn industry to sanitize its products by stripping away the dirt factor and reconstituting porn as fun, edgy, chic, sexy, and hot. As Ellie perfectly put it, pornography has become synonymous with sexual liberation, free speech, emancipation from repression, and it's very difficult to speak out about it without being labelled a prude, a moraliser, and an enemy of free speech. And actually, I would argue that this ideology that's around pornography has become really important because, as well as becoming very popular and profitable, pornography has also become really extreme. Material that would have been banned or refused classification 20, 30 years ago is now common and mainstream. And probably it's worth asking why that is. Before, only a tiny minority of men would seek out really dark stuff, and now so many more people are looking for it. It's incredibly popular and thus profitable. And to understand that question, I think we need to know that porn is not sex. Porn is to sex what McDonald's is to food. It's junk. It's a highly refined product that's been carefully designed to manipulate and to exploit our natural appetites and impulses. And it does so very cleverly. When we watch pornography, our brains are flooded with abnormally high levels of dopamine. These overwhelm our brain's reward centres. And over time, this desensitizes us. This means that we need more extreme, novel, or hardcore content in order to maintain the same level of arousal. So this escalation in extremity is not a coincidence, it's not an accident, but it's a direct result of the porn industry's expansion. How does the porn industry respond? Well, it makes a lot of money from it. It provides what people want. It supplies the demand that it has created. So as the lovely Dr. Ellie Hansen says, the porn business can readily showcase, encourage interest in, and thus make money from opposing sexual scripts, notably those in personal sex, boundary breaking, objectification, violence, misogyny, dominance, and the corruption of innocence. And actually it needs to do that, because if it doesn't, users will get bored, they'll disengage, they'll move away from the website, and in a context of fierce market competition, they'll simply lose out. So porn sites can't afford to have standards. This has led to the situation where now, Rule 34, if it exists or can be imagined, there is internet porn of it. This was around the 2000s. It's fair to say that there are a couple of taboos around pornography now, mostly around necrophilia and bestiality. But I think there's an overarching theme for the vast majority of pornography, and that is the abuse of power. Pornography usually involves a man taking advantage of somebody who is relatively vulnerable by age, sex, race, socioeconomic status. It basically is some form of exploitation. This is some of the teen porn depicting children and adolescents being abused by teachers, fathers, stepfathers, coaches, you name it. Actually, this stuff wasn't always legal. In 1996, in the US, there was a Child Porn Protection Act that prevented even the representation of children in pornography. But this was overturned by the lobbying arm of the porn industry, known as the Free Speech Coalition. They spent $1 million overturning it. They said, no, it's really important that we can at least represent children in pornography. But if it's just adults pretending to be children, dressing up with different props, is it a problem? Well, people argue that people have their rights, their kinks and their fetishes, and if they're consenting adults being involved, who does it hurt? It's not real life. And that brings me to my first point, that it minimises the harm of sexual abuse. So the sort of pornography we're talking about depicts illegal scenarios, but they're kind of labelled or depicted in ways that minimise or remove the criminality and mock or belittle any possibility of harm. So this kind of pornography really does legitimise children's bodies as objects of sexual desire, and that really undermines the social norm that we have, that children's bodies are off limits. Again, Dr. Gail Dance, once he clicks on these sites, the user is bombarded through images and words with an internally consistent ideology that legitimises, condones and celebrates sexual desire for children. The norms and values that circulate in society, which define adult child sex as deviant and abusive, are wholly absent. And I think while most of us would like to have a position that anyone can watch whatever they like, as Ellie says, we're kind of under pressure to be very tolerant. Our feelings beneath the surface are a bit ambiguous. I think, we can see this with, for example, Neil Parish, the MP that was caught watching pornography in the House of Commons. For a society that generally accepts pornography, the response was very interesting. There was general outrage, and partly maybe this was because it was watched in public, but people were very quick to link it to the wider culture of sexism and misogyny and sexual misconduct in Westminster. And rightly so, it's difficult to watch material that consistently represents women a certain way without it having some impact. And I remember looking at a story, reading a story in the paper about this woman. She was divorced, she had 2 daughters, and she discovered that her new partner had been looking at stepdaughter pornography. She was horrified and broke up with her. He said, oh, what I'm doing is completely legal, I haven't laid a finger on my children, on your children. But it's kind of, with titles like this, it's easy to empathise with her. She didn't feel that she wanted to be a man who would be fantasising and filling his mind with things like that. What we look at, what we watch, has an impact on us. It has an effect on us. We can't be indifferent. It shapes our worldview, it shapes our understanding of ourselves and our view of other people, and it's dangerous. We recognise this in advertising and media. There are certain standards, there are certain minimum standards. Advertisers can't promote racism, for example, but pornography seems to be outside of those considerations. It's interesting that proponents of pornography will often use the twin arguments of privacy and free speech, freedom of expression. But free speech and free expression, this is about expressing yourself, it's speaking, it's about debate in the public square, and yet they don't want it to be public. They want pornographers to have the absolute right to publish anything that transgresses all social boundaries and norms, and users to have complete freedom to consume this content without question or scrutiny. Of course, it's impossible to draw a direct line between what somebody watches, what they fill their mind with, and what they think and what they do. It's not something that can be measured in a test tube. However, there is so much evidence from academic literature, from a range of countries, across a range of disciplines, from popular culture, from criminal law cases, to show that there is a link between pornography and people's sexual expectations and behaviours. That brings me to my second point, that pornography drives offending behaviour. I've been speaking to Mike Sheath at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation about his experiences. He started working there. The Lucy Faithfull Foundation works with offenders, sex offenders, particularly men who seek out CSAM, child sexual abuse material. He was saying the profile of offender has changed significantly over the past 20, 30 years. When he started, it was usually child molesters who were treated, men who had some kind of dysfunction and had often suffered abuse in their own childhood. Today, he said, it's men from all kinds of different backgrounds. The only thing they have in common is a pornography addiction. A lot of them access pornography from a very young age. And as we've seen, when we watch lots of pornography, it leads to desensitisation and an extremity, an escalation of tastes and preferences. This effect is particularly strong in childhood, so if people start watching porn from a young age, it has a very powerful effect on them. And when we start watching deviant, extreme material, we have to, as Ellie said, sort of cut off the part of ourselves that has a conscience or has empathy for the person in the video. We have to kind of put all of our scruples to sleep, and you can understand how that's quite dangerous, because it can lead it leads people from using this extreme material, particularly teen porn, as a stepping stone or an entry drug into real illegal child sexual abuse material. So Mike says, what we are seeing on a daily basis is a conflation of easy access to hardcore and deviant pornography and an interest in child molestation. The link is unambiguous. Some people can watch it and not become offenders, but unfortunately there is a large and increasing number of men that are becoming interested in children. One of the offenders said, I was completely confused with how I removed myself from my deeds, as I was in fact a highly empathetic person in real life, that only when the police came did I register that there were humans on the other side of the screen. These were children, not JPEGs or MP4s. They said, how could you have not made this connection? Pornography forces us to shut off that empathy. We objectify the other person. Don't see them as a human being. We see them as different body parts. So Mike says, as he's treating these men, he asks them to look at the image. I ask the girl's age. I say, what do you reckon her name is? What do you think she likes doing at school? They look absolutely horrified. They've never considered it. These men don't consider themselves themselves as paedophiles. They have such a deep sense of shame because they've just been led down these dark roads, blindly following the path of their sexual arousal and sexual desires. The police have noticed exactly the same thing. Obviously the problem of child sexual abuse material is huge. The police are completely overwhelmed, and a lot of the young recruits are very enthusiastic about catching child molesters, and they find they're just catching porn addicts. They're just catching ordinary family men whose lives are absolutely devastated. Rates of suicide are very high, families are torn apart because they weren't born this way. They're not particularly likely to necessarily contact these children, but they have been seeking out illegal content for that fix. So thirdly, I want to move on to how pornography, this kind of pornography in particular, exacerbates children's vulnerability. It's very interesting that it's sort of okay to have an interest in teen porn. Nobody objects to teen porn particularly, but as soon as somebody comes out and identifies as a MAP, a minor attracted person, there is general outrage. We still have a problem with MAPs and paedophiles. Sorry, that's a quotation from the Chief of Police. So on Twitter, a lot of the hashtags to do with MAPs actually are young people and children themselves who basically are inviting MAPs, minor attracted persons, to use and abuse them. This is really horrifying. They are choosing or consenting to do awful things because they're in a world saturated with messaging for pornography that normalises this stuff, that even portrays it as being desirable. They often will put their self-worth into being seen as a sexual object, being sexually available to older men. CESE has just set up a website called Exploitation that is a space for people to share stories of the ways in which pornography has harmed them. And the testimony from Jane says, "My innocent childhood fantasies about what it really meant to be in a loving relationship evaporated and were replaced by toxic beliefs of my value lay in my sexual availability. Not only that, but porn had normalised male domination and control to such an extent that not only was I completely blind to its dangers, but I was actually drawn to it. BDSM porn had taught me that coercion, control, and domination submission were not dangerous, but exciting." So she accessed porn at the age of 8. All this happened to her in her early teens. Children are accessing pornography just as much as adults, and it's shaping what they see as normal or acceptable. You can see how this makes them so much more vulnerable to being groomed and abused by men. It doesn't take much. And it's interesting that Jane talks about being crippled by a sense of shame at crossing her own moral boundaries. So the men who are watching this pornography have to cross their own moral boundaries to watch it, but it also affects the girls that end up sort of role-playing things they don't really want to do. As we've been working with Bernardo's, we've heard lots of harrowing stories from their caseworkers, particularly around how victims of familial abuse were unaware that what was being done to them was abuse because they'd seen it so much in pornography or been shown it. Incest porn is very popular. So how do we expect children to know right from wrong, to know what is abusive and healthy when they are surrounded by stuff that is so normalised and presented in a way that's nothing short of propaganda, really? And the last point I want to end with is that we assume, and it's an assumption, that the young people we see on porn sites are adult actors, petite-looking women made with props and the like to look like children. But there are no age and consent checks for porn sites. So in reality, a lot of the images we'll see are genuinely child sexual abuse material. They are children. This is...
I had a situation where a guy older than me asked me repeatedly And after a while, I finally caved in and I sent him one. And that was the beginning of years of just anxiety, trauma. It was put on Pornhub about a month after I sent it to the guy. And I immediately messaged Pornhub pretending to be my mom, trying to get them to take it down. They would wait weeks to respond, and then I would have to say, like, hey, this is my child, she's 14, do I need to get a lawyer involved before they would finally send a response saying that they would take it down and that, it wouldn't be able to be uploaded again. But sure enough, a couple days or a couple weeks later, it'd be right back on the site. And I'd have to do this over and over and over again. And finally, I just started messaging them as myself, just saying, hi, this is me in the video. I am still a minor in this video. I still don't want this online. And it's, it's a very dark part of my life. And they made me go through all of these steps, just proving who I was. I'd have to send them pictures of like my ID next to my face, as well as like a piece of paper with my name and the date written on it, and a whole bunch of other things before they would finally even consider taking it down, just for it to be put right back up again. And so, as time went on, I dropped out of school. I started doing drugs. I became homeless, and I didn't know what else to do, so I ended up with a guy older than me, and he convinced me that because there's already video, everybody had already seen the videos. I've been bullied when I was going to school for the videos being online, which is why I dropped out. He convinced me that it would be fine to make money, just do more.
Sorry for the lack of introduction. That was Sabina Fleets, who was giving evidence to Congress on about Pornhub. You can see that these big porn sites have no incentive to remove the abusive material because they're profiting from it. And I hope this video also shows, I'm sure this is something you're so familiar with, how one kind of incident like that trigger this horrible downward spiral that has such a profound impact on the rest of their life, and it sort of multiplies the vulnerability. She ends up, in the commercial sex industry, still as a minor, selling videos, sexualized videos of herself. Once she's sort of dehumanized and treated in a certain way, it's very difficult to come back from that. So, yes, we are lobbying the government for greater regulation. There's no reason why the pornography industry should be an exception to the rule, why basic safeguards and child protection measures shouldn't apply to this multi-billion-dollar industry as much as any other industry. Just because it's an adult industry doesn't mean that children aren't being profoundly harmed in so many different